Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The exiled documents had been framed crookedly from the start, and Elian Marsh had never bothered to straighten them. It wasn't defiance, exactly. It was more that the clinic on Dureth 9 had given him approximately 47 more urgent problems on the day he'd arrived. And by the time those were resolved, there were 47 different ones. And the documents on the wall had simply become part of the texture of the place, like the water stain on the ceiling above bed 2 that Merritt kept promising to fix, or the particular grinding sound the front door made in cold weather that the settlement's children had taken to imitating as a greeting. The gold seal of the Vahari Empress caught the morning light at a slight angle that made it look, depending on the hour, either very official or vaguely embarrassed. Elian had come to prefer the latter. "You have been awake," said Tercet, from the corner where his unit sat charging, "for 22 hours and 14 minutes. I'm aware. I mention it only because you are currently reviewing the same blood panel you reviewed 40 minutes ago, and your notation in the margin reads, and I quote, 'check again,' which suggests diminishing analytical returns." Tercet: "Yes, doctor. Go back to sleep. I am an AI medical unit with no sleep cycle, a fact I have mentioned on several previous occasions with what I feel has been admirable patience." Elian set down the blood panel. Outside, Dureth 9's second moon was doing its slow crawl across a sky the color of old copper, and the settlement's handful of lights made small arguments against the dark. It was the kind of night that felt geologically old, the kind that existed on frontier moons long before anyone built anything on them, and would exist long after whatever humanity and its neighbors constructed had been quietly absorbed back into the rock. Elian had, in the 18 months since his arrival, developed a complicated relationship with nights like this. Not peaceful, exactly, but honest in a way that the capital of the Vahari Empire, with its towers of bioluminescent architecture and its press rooms and its very official documents, had not been. The clinic held 4 beds. 2 were occupied. In bed 1, old Fenrath, who was 80-something and had strong opinions about everything including his own cardiovascular system and how it was being managed, was asleep with his arms crossed in a posture of dignified disapproval that he maintained even unconscious. In bed 2, a child from the settlement's eastern quarter had a respiratory infection that was responding to treatment with the particular grudging slowness of a patient who felt their illness deserved more recognition before surrendering. The blood panel Elian had been reviewing twice was hers. "Her oxygen saturation is up," he said, mostly to himself. "It is," Tercet agreed, in a tone of mild encouragement. "It has been up for the last 3 reviews as well. This is, I believe, the direction we prefer. You're doing that thing where you're patient with me. I'm always patient with you. It is, I confess, occasionally a creative exercise." The supply manifest was on the desk beside the panel. The latest ship had come in 2 days ago, carrying 63% of what had been requested, which Elian had been informed by the supply coordinator was actually quite good for this quarter. He had thanked her with sincere professionalism, and then returned to the clinic and stared at the manifest for a long time in silence. The antiseptic foam was at 20%. The synthetic plasma extender, calibrated for human biology, and therefore requiring adjustment for the settlement's mixed population of 3 humans, a family of Drenathi, and approximately 40 Vahari-descended colonists whose ancestors had made it out to the frontier 3 generations ago, was nearly gone. He had written to the medical directorate of the Vahari Empire 8 months ago requesting either a calibrated supply or the formulary access to calibrate the human stock himself. He had received a form letter informing him that his practitioner credentials did not currently meet Vahari imperial medical standards for formulary access, which was both technically true and the most elegant way the Empire had yet found to remind him of what had been taken. The letter was not framed on the wall. It was in the recycling bin, where it had been for 7 months, because he kept forgetting to actually recycle it, which probably said something he wasn't prepared to examine. The gold seal of the Empress caught the moonlight. Elian looked at it. He had met her once, briefly, in the corridor outside the press room, before the forum, before the documents, before all of it, when she had been reviewing the medical directorate's quarterly report, and he had been waiting to submit his complaint through official channels for the 3rd time, still believing, with the particular optimism of someone who had not yet learned that official channels are sometimes decorative. She had looked at him with those eyes, the second membrane sliding slowly, the way it did when she was thinking, he would learn later, and said something brief and not unkind about the waiting room chairs, and then moved on. He had thought in that corridor that she was the kind of person who understood exactly how much space she occupied in any given room and chose, with precision, how much of it to use. He had not thought she would use any of it to flatten him professionally. He had been, his mother would have said, optimistic to a fault. His mother was a very wise woman who lived on Earth and sent him food packages that arrived 4 months late and tasted, by the time they reached Durath 9, like compressed nostalgia and thermal padding. "Doctor," said Tercet, "I'm not reviewing the panel again." "No," said Tercet, and something in the unit's voice had shifted, the mild philosophical detachment replaced by something more direct. "The emergency beacon frequency has activated. Crash signal. Coordinates northeast approximately 4 kilometers. Shuttle class by the signature. Vahari registration." Elian was still for a moment. The child in bed too breathed slowly, improving. Old Fenrath disapproved of something in his sleep. The crookedly framed documents caught the light at their usual embarrassed angle. He picked up his field kit. "Prepare the 2 emergency units." "Already done," said Tercet. "Doctor, the registration code." "Can wait," said Elian, and walked out into the dark. The rock flats northeast of the settlement were the kind of terrain that existed specifically to make bad situations worse. Elian had crossed them twice before, once to reach a Drenathi farmer who had made poor decisions involving heavy machinery, once because he had taken a wrong turn in the dark and spent 40 minutes in conversation with a rock formation he had initially mistaken for a person. The ground was all ridge and hollow, volcanic in origin, the kind of surface that grabbed at boot soles with what felt like personal conviction. Tonight it was also cold, the temperature having dropped with the cheerful indifference that frontier moons applied to human comfort, and his breath came out in short visible clouds that the comm unit's exterior light caught and dissolved. Tercet guided him via the beacon coordinates with the calm efficiency of a unit that did not have to navigate the terrain physically, and therefore had no strong feelings about it. 40 meters northeast, Tercet said, in Elian's earpiece. Bear slightly left. There is a ridge drop approximately 8 meters ahead that I would describe as significant. A pause. The beacon's signature has strengthened. That is generally positive. Though I acknowledge that generally is doing considerable work in that sentence. "Noted," said Elian, and found the ridge drop with his boot before his eyes did, caught himself on the rock face and continued. The shuttle had come down across a natural shelf of stone in a way that told him immediately that the pilot had been making decisions under pressure and making them fast. The impact line ran 30 meters, maybe more. A long, grinding skid rather than a direct fall, which meant deceleration, which meant someone at the controls had been fighting for every meter of survival they could negotiate from a situation that had stopped cooperating. It was the kind of crash that made pilots either legendary or posthumous, depending on factors entirely outside their control. The shuttle itself was in 3 main pieces and several smaller ones. The hull opened along its port side like something had disagreed with it at a molecular level, and the emergency lighting still functioning in the rear section gave the wreckage a dim, reddish glow that turned the whole scene into something between a rescue operation and a fever dream. He found the first 2 passengers within 90 seconds. He did not linger. The third was in the rear section, beneath a collapsed support frame, and she was alive. He confirmed this before anything else. 2 fingers to the pulse point at her throat where Vihari physiology placed it, slightly lower than human, and found it. Fast, shallow, not what he wanted but present, which was the only category that mattered right now. She was young. The bioluminescence beneath her skin, that extraordinary biological signature that Vihari carried like a second circulatory system made of light, was flickering and uneven, which in a healthy Vihari child would never happen, and in this one told him everything about her circulatory status before Tersit had finished downloading the field scanner data. She was losing pressure somewhere internal. The support frame across her left side was a problem he would need to solve in the next 3 minutes, and the problem was that the frame was not small, and he was one person, and the relevant question was what he had in the field kit that could substitute for the second pair of hands he did not have. "Tersit," he said, setting the kit down and opening it with practiced efficiency in the red emergency light. "I'm going to need the plasma extender recalibrated for full Vihari baseline. Female, juvenile, approximately 10 to 12 years. Recalibrating. I should mention that our supply is limited, and the Vihari adjustment will require approximately 15% more volume than the human standard dose to achieve equivalent effect." "I know. I mention it not to be discouraging, but because you sometimes make more economical decisions when reminded of constraints in advance. Tersit, I need you to calculate and talk less. These are not mutually exclusive activities, but I take your point." The support frame came loose on the third attempt, with the help of a pry bar from the shuttle's own emergency kit that Elian located by the practical method of looking for it in the dark, while simultaneously monitoring her pulse with the scanner, which was the kind of multitasking that residency training built into the nervous system, until it became less a skill and more a survival reflex. He moved the frame, he assessed, he began. What followed was not elegant. Frontier medicine was never elegant, it was resourceful, which was a kinder word for the same desperation dressed in professional clothing. The tissue bonding applicator had 30% charge. He used it in short, precise bursts, spending the charge the way you spent the last of anything irreplaceable. Carefully, without waste, with the specific focus of someone who knows the number is fixed and declining. The bone alignment frame he had brought was designed for moderate fractures in adult patients and had strong feelings about being asked to do more than this, which it expressed through a series of warning tones that escalated gradually from advisory to plaintive. "It's fine," Elian told it. The frame produced a tone that suggested it disagreed. "It is objectively not fine," Tersit confirmed helpfully, "but the alternative is worse, so I recommend we continue and file the equipment complaint later." The girl's vitals shifted, not dramatically, not in the way dramatic things happened in medical simulations where everything responded on cue. They shifted the way real improvements happened, which was gradually, and with the stubborn reluctance of a body that had been through something serious and was not prepared to simply bounce back because someone asked it to. Elian adjusted the plasma extender line and watched the scanner and breathed slowly through the cold, and 4 kilometers behind him the clinic lights were on, because Tersit had remotely activated the emergency units, and the settlement was waking up in the small ways settlements woke. A light here, a door there. Merritt's window going from dark to lit because Merritt noticed things. "I am also detecting," Tersit said, "an active monitoring signal on the emergency frequency. Long-range vessel, Vihari military class by the bandwidth signature. They have locked onto the crash beacon." A pause. "They are receiving your treatment log. I have been transmitting it on the open channel as standard protocol." "Good," said Elian, not looking up from the scanner. "They are, I would estimate, 4 to 6 hours out." "Fine." "The registration code of the monitoring vessel," Tersit began, "is—" "Send the log," said Elian. "Recalculate the extender, tell me her temperature." Tersit told him her temperature. Elian processed it and made 2 adjustments and did not ask about the registration code. And the reddish emergency light moved across the rock, and the girl breathed slowly, with increasing regularity. And somewhere in the dark above Dureth 9 copper-colored sky, on a vessel whose registration code Elian had deliberately declined to hear, someone was reading a treatment log, and the bioluminescence along their cheekbones was doing something their communications officer had never seen before, and would spend a long time afterward failing to find the right word for. The Imperial flagship ran on a crew of 412, and in the 49 minutes since Empress Sail Vahari had taken her position at the communications monitoring station on Deck 3, approximately 380 of those 412 had found urgent professional reasons to be somewhere else. This was not cowardice. It was institutional memory. The crew of the flagship had served long enough to develop a precise and well-calibrated understanding of which silences were safe to be near and which ones had weather inside them, and the silence currently occupying the monitoring station had weather in it of a kind that had not been seen in 12 years of service. Admiral Verath had sent the non-essential personnel away herself. She had done this quietly, efficiently, and without explanation, because explanations would have required acknowledging out loud what everyone on the deck had already understood, which was that the Empress of 11 star systems was reading a field treatment log from a frontier clinic on a moon that most of the Empire's navigation systems listed as a waypoint rather than a destination, and that she had been reading it and rereading it for the better part of an hour without speaking. Foley's, the communications officer, remained at his post because someone had to, and because the short straw had been drawn fairly and he had nobody to blame but probability. The treatment log scrolled on the monitor in Elian Marsh's handwriting, or rather, in Tersit's transcription of it, which preserved the clinical shorthand and the margin notations, and the single place where the handwriting became briefly and expressively illegible, which Tersit had transcribed as notation unclear. Context suggests frustration with equipment. Sail had read that line 3 times. She had read the plasma extender recalibration notation twice. She had read the bone alignment frame warning sequence, the escalating tones rendered in text as a parenthetical by Tersit, labeled simply equipment objection, sustained. And something had happened to her expression that Verath, watching from a careful distance, had filed away in the part of her memory she reserved for things she would think about later and at length. Sail understood medicine the way heads of state understood things they had not practiced but had governed for years, structurally, administratively, well enough to know when something was being done at the boundary of what it was reasonable to do. The tissue bonding applicator at 30% charge was not a detail that slipped past her. The plasma extender adjustment for Vahari juvenile biology, performed in a field setting without a calibrated scanner, was not something she read without understanding what it required. She had sat on the Imperial Health Directorate's oversight board for 6 years. She had signed the documents that rejected Elian Marsh's formulary access request 8 months ago. She knew, because it was her empire and she had made it her business to know, that the clinic on Dureth 9 operated on supplies that arrived at 60-something% of requisition, that the equipment was frontier grade, that there was 1 physician and 1 medical AI unit for a settlement of mixed species in a system that the Directorate classified as non-priority. She had known all of this. She had signed the access rejection anyway. Foley's at his post was making himself very small. The patient's temperature, Verath said, quietly, reading the latest log entry over Sail's shoulder with the careful deference of someone who had calculated exactly how close she was permitted to stand, has dropped by 0.8 degrees. That's movement in the right direction. I know which direction that is, Sail said, and her voice was level, and the bioluminescence along her cheekbones pulsed once out of rhythm. Verath did not say anything else. This was why she was an admiral. The flagship was 4 hours and 17 minutes out from Durath 9 at current speed. Sale had ordered maximum acceleration 11 minutes ago, which had shaved the estimate to 3 hours and 52 minutes, which was either comforting or insufficient depending on what the treatment log's next entry showed. The next entry came through while she was thinking about it. Tercet's transmission was running on a 15-minute cycle, regular as anything, and it showed the girl's vitals stabilizing incrementally, the plasma extender holding, the bone alignment frame continuing what Tercet had labeled in his most recent parenthetical as ongoing philosophical objection to operational parameters, unresolved but functional. Sale read this, and the thing that happened to her expression happened again, briefly, and Verath looked at the middle distance with great professionalism. It was in this moment, with the log updating and the flagship cutting through the dark between star systems, and the weather inside the silence reaching its most complex meteorological point, that Sale allowed herself to think about the forum. Not the official record of it, she had the official record memorized, had returned to it in those first weeks after the exile with the particular attention of someone building a case for a decision already made. She thought about the actual room, the press lighting, which was always slightly too bright and cast everyone in a quality of exposure they hadn't consented to. The way Elian Marsh had stood at the podium with the mortality figures laid out in front of him, and the way he had spoken, not with anger, which she could have dismissed, and not with political ambition, which she could have anticipated, but with the flat, exhausted precision of someone who had been watching people die from preventable causes and had run out of patience for the appropriate channels. He had said systematically negligent and deliberately concealed, and the room had been very still, and she had felt, in that stillness, the specific sensation of someone pulling a thread she had been careful not to pull. She had been afraid, she admitted now to herself, in the way that only genuinely powerful people could be afraid, not of him, but of what following the thread would require her to look at. It was easier to remove the person pulling it. "Ma'am," said Foley's from his post, with the tone of a man who was sincerely sorry to speak, but had calculated that silence was the worse option. "There's a new entry in the log." Sale looked at the monitor. Tercet had transmitted. "Patient stable, fever reducing. Physician has fallen asleep in the chair beside the patient. I have adjusted the clinic temperature to account for the drop in overnight ambient. He did not ask me to do this. I note it for the record as standard duty of care to clinic personnel. His last verbal instruction before losing consciousness was to wake him if there was any change, which I will do, though I intend to give him another 40 minutes first. I note this decision also for the record. I find I am not sorry about it." Foley's made a sound. It was a very small sound. It escaped before he had properly evaluated it, which he recognized immediately as a professional error. He converted it smoothly into a cough. Admiral Verath gave him a look that communicated several complete sentences without using any words. He found a data panel to study with intense interest. Sale did not move for a long moment. The bioluminescence along her cheekbones was doing the slow, steady thing, not the fractured pulse of the last hour, but something more even, more considered, like a person breathing deliberately because the alternative is losing composure in front of their communications officer, which empresses do not do. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the monitor, not a command gesture, just a touch, the kind of touch that had no administrative function, the kind that meant something else entirely. "Increase speed," she said. Verath said, "We are at maximum, ma'am." Sale removed her fingers from the monitor. "Then we wait," she said, and sat back, and the flagship moved through the dark at the fastest it was capable of going, which was, like most things in this situation, not quite fast enough and going to have to be sufficient. Merritt had made something hot. She always made something hot when the situation was beyond her direct control, which was, she had once told Elian, the most honest response available to a person who had survived 40 years on frontier moons. You identified the things you could not fix and you made tea or something adjacent to tea, and you delivered it without commentary and let the universe sort out the rest. She appeared at the clinic door at 400 with a thermal container and 2 cups, and looked at the Imperial shuttle sitting on the settlement's main path and the 4 Imperial guards standing at its ramp and the single set of footprints in the frost leading from the shuttle to the clinic. And she said, very quietly, "Well," and knocked on the door anyway. Tercet let her in. Tercet was capable of managing the clinic's door mechanism remotely, which he did selectively, and with what Elian suspected was a developed sense of occasion. He let Marit in. He had not yet let anyone else approach, and the 3 settlement residents who had woken to find an Imperial vessel in their path and crept close enough to read its markings had been redirected, gently but firmly, by the guard. Durath 9 had not, in anyone's living memory, received a visit of any Imperial significance. The settlement's weather scanner was almost certainly not equipped to log this as an event, which felt like an oversight. Elian was awake. He had been awake since Tercet had said his name in that particular tone at 3:37, the tone that carried the weight of several pieces of information compressed into 2 syllables. He had checked the girl's vitals first. Stable, improved, the bioluminescence under her skin steady, and even now in a way that had made something in his chest unknot by precise increments over the last hour. He had then stood in the center of his clinic and had a brief, private conversation with himself about the nature of the situation, which Tercet had interrupted only once to offer the observation that pacing was not a recognized medical intervention, and that if Elian intended to continue, he might at least do it more quietly so the patient could sleep. He was not pacing when the door opened. He was standing at his work table, looking at the supply manifest, which had not improved overnight but gave him something to look at. That wasn't the door. She came in alone. He had not expected that. 4 Imperial guard at the ramp. Admiral Verath visible through the window, standing at the bottom of the shuttle's ramp, with the posture of a woman executing the professional discipline of her life. And the Empress of 11-star systems came into his clinic alone, in full diplomatic dress that had no business being in a room with mismatched lighting, and a bone alignment frame drying in the corner after its long night of philosophical objection. She was taller than the official portraits. He had known he would think this. He thought it anyway. Neither of them spoke immediately. This was, Elian would later decide, the most honest moment between them. The unstructured seconds before either of them reached for language, when the clinic was simply a clinic, and she was simply a parent who had crossed the dark in 3 hours and 50 minutes to reach a room where her child was breathing steadily, and he was simply the physician who had gotten her there. Tercet, demonstrating the extraordinary situational intelligence he deployed only when it mattered most, said nothing at all. She looked at her daughter first. She crossed to the bed and stood over her and looked at her for a long time, and the bioluminescence along her cheekbones did the slow, tidal thing, and Elian looked at the manifest. He gave her the time. It cost him nothing to give her the time, and it was the right thing, and he had learned in 18 months on Durath 9 that the right things were usually quiet. When she turned, her eyes found the framed documents on the wall before they found him. The gold seal, the crooked frame. She looked at them for a moment with the expression of someone locating a piece of evidence they had been told about and are now confirming with their own eyes. Then she looked at him. She would have died, Sale said. Yes. You knew who she was. It was not quite a question. The membrane slid slowly across her eyes. Elian considered the honest answer, which was the only one available to him. Tercet mentioned the registration code. About 40 minutes in, he paused. I told him to recalculate the extender ratios. Sale looked at Tercet's unit in the corner. Tercet's indicator light, which was normally a steady blue, flickered once in what Elian could only interpret as acknowledgement. That is, she said, carefully, accurate. He told me to stop editorializing. Tercet said this in a tone of pure informational service, and it was so precisely timed that Elian looked at the ceiling and Sale looked at the medical unit, and the tension in the room did the thing that well-placed honesty sometimes did. It shifted, slightly, from unbearable to merely very heavy, which was the direction they needed. "I read your treatment log," she said, "all of it. I know. The bone alignment frame. It had opinions." Tercet described them as a sustained philosophical objection. "That's generous. I would have said it was catastrophizing." She looked at the work table, at the empty plasma extender line, coiled and cleaned, and returned to its spot with the careful economy of someone who accounted for every supply because the next shipment was uncertain. At the tissue bonding applicator in its charging cradle, the charge indicator reading 4% because that was what remained. At the manifest on the table, with its column of requisitioned items and its column of received items and the space between those two columns where a year of letters to the medical directorate had disappeared without result. The exiled documents on the wall caught the morning light coming through the clinic's single east-facing window. The gold seal looked embarrassed. It was, Elian had always thought, the most accurate thing in the room. "I read your complaint," she said. "The original, not the official record, the original filing." She did not look away from the work table. "I had it retrieved from the archive 3 months ago." Elian had not expected that. He had expected many versions of this conversation, had constructed them involuntarily in the long nights of the frontier, but not that. He said nothing, because nothing was the right response while she found the words for whatever came next. "The mortality rates you cited," she said, "were accurate. We have since corrected the conditions that produced them, quietly, without announcement." She paused. "That is not sufficient. I am aware that it is not sufficient." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "The credentials," she said and stopped, tried again. "The blacklisting, what was done to your position at every institution in the empire." She looked at him directly. "I could present you with an argument for why it was a necessary demonstration of authority. I could make it coherent. I have made it coherent to myself for 18 months. She stopped again. "I will not insult you by making it now." The clinic was quiet. Outside, Dureth 9's sun was beginning its slow argument with the copper sky. The child in the imperial bed breathed evenly. Old Fenrath, in bed 1, had woken at some point in the last hour, and had taken in the Empress of 11-star systems standing in his clinic, and had pulled his blanket up with the dignified composure of a man who disapproved of the situation, but was reserving formal comment. "There will be a full reinstatement," Sale said. "Credentials, research access, institutional standing, the formulary access that was rejected, a formal correction of the blacklisting to every institution that received it." She looked at the manifest on his table, and a supply directive for this clinic, properly calibrated, full requisition, not 60%. Elian looked at her for a long time. She held it without flinching, which he had expected. She was not a person who flinched, but there was something in how she held it that was different from the composure of the official portraits. It was the composure of someone standing in an honest place they had not stood before and choosing to stay there. "The patients here," he said, "need the supply directive now, before anything else." "I know," she said. "I have already sent it." He nodded. Merritt, who had been standing near the door with the thermal container in a posture of absolute invisible discretion, held out a cup toward the general center of the room. Elian took it. After a moment, Sale took the other. Merritt refilled the container from somewhere about her person with the practiced efficiency of a frontier survivor who had learned to be ready for any category of event, and retreated to the door, where she stood quietly and made no comment of any kind, because 40 years on frontier moons had also taught her when a room needed a witness and not a participant. The girl stirred. It was a small movement, the kind that preceded waking, a shift of the hand, a change in breathing. Sale was at the bedside before the movement finished, and the child opened her eyes and found her mother's face above her, and reached up with the longer, elegant Vahari fingers. And Sale took her hand and sat on the edge of the narrow clinic bed and said something quiet in Vahari that Elian's translation software rendered imperfectly but adequately. Tersit dimmed the lights by 15%. Elian looked at the unit. The indicator light held its steady blue. He thought about saying something to Tersit about the unsolicited atmospheric adjustments and decided, as he had decided every previous time, that some arguments were not worth having. He drank the tea Marat had made. Outside, the weather scanner predicted sun, which meant it would probably rain, and the settlement was fully awake now. And the Imperial Guard at the ramp were being offered breakfast by 2 settlement residents, who had decided that visitors were visitors regardless of insignia. And Admiral Verath had accepted a cup of something from a Drenathi child, and was holding it with the careful respect of a person who did not know what it contained, but understood the spirit in which it was offered. Elian Marsh, formerly senior consultant to the Vahari Imperial Medical Directorate, currently the only physician on a frontier moon that the Empire's navigation systems listed as a waypoint, stood in his clinic with a cup of imperfect tea and watched a mother hold her daughter's hand and felt, with the clarity that came only after the long nights and the improvised equipment and the manifests with their honest columns, that the Exile had not taken what it had intended to take. It had taken the credentials, the access, the institutional standing,